My mother-in-law sold my wedding dress to pay for her daughter's vacation, so I canceled her retirement surprise. The mahogany wardrobe didn't just look broken, it looked violated. I stood in the center of my dressing room, 48 hours before my wedding, staring at the jagged wood splinters on the carpet. My mother's hand-stitched lace gown, a $15,000 masterpiece she finished just before she passed, was gone. The hanger swung back and forth, empty and mocking. My breath hitched as I spotted a neon yellow sticky note slapped onto the mirror. It was Martha's handwriting, sharp and entitled. "Don't be selfish, rehab," the note read. "Your sister-in-law needed a break. Family helps family." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Just then, my phone chimed with a notification. I opened Instagram and saw my sister-in-law, Sarah, lounging by a turquoise pool in Bali. Her caption read, "Thanks, Mom, for the unexpected gift. Best vacation ever." The room spun as the betrayal settled into my bones. I found Martha in the kitchen, casually blowing steam off a cup of expensive herbal tea. She didn't even look up when I slammed the sticky note onto the marble island. I demanded to know where my mother's dress was. Martha took a slow, deliberate sip before looking me in the eye with cold indifference. She admitted she had sold it to a high-end vintage collector for fast cash. "You have plenty of money in your trust, rehab," she said, her voice smooth as silk. My daughter was depressed and needed a luxury escape. "It's just fabric, dear. Don't be so dramatic." I felt a roar building in my chest, but she wasn't finished. She leaned forward, eyeing my waist with a cruel smirk. "Besides, you've grown a bit bloated for that lace lately. Consider it a favor. You would have looked ridiculous." I waited for David to come home, certain he would fix this. When he walked through the door, I told him everything through hot, angry tears. I expected him to call his mother and demand the dress back, but instead, he wouldn't even look at me. He hung up his coat and sighed like I was the one being difficult. "My mom just wanted to help Sarah, rehab," he said, his voice flat. "She was in a dark place. I'll just buy you a new dress from the mall tomorrow. Let's not ruin the big retirement gala we are throwing for Mom next month over some old clothes." My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just the dress, it was the way he dismissed my mother's memory. Then, the realization hit me like a physical blow. David didn't look surprised. He knew about the sale before it happened. The house felt like a tomb that night. While David snored beside me, I stayed awake, my mind racing through every conversation we had over the last 6 months. I crept into his home office and opened his laptop. I was looking for a receipt for this mall dress he promised, but I found something much worse. There was an email thread between Martha and David titled, Phase 1, Liquidating Rehab's Assets. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped the mouse. I scrolled through pages of plans. The wedding dress was only the beginning of their scheme. They had been mapping out a way to drain my inheritance to fund a golden years luxury villa for Martha. They didn't love me, they were farming me. Subscribe for more revenge stories to see how rehab handles these vultures. I closed my eyes and was suddenly back in my mother's small sewing room. I could still smell the lavender she kept in her pincushion. I remembered the way her aged hands shook as she pulled the needle through the delicate lace, promising me that this dress would be my shield. She told me that when I wore it, I would know I was protected and loved. She spent years on those stitches, pouring her soul into the fabric for my big day. Back in the present, the silence of the dark office felt heavy. I reached up to touch my neck, seeking the comfort of my mother's diamond pendant. My skin was bare. I ran to my jewelry box and flung it open. The pendant was gone too. Martha hadn't just sold my dress, she was stripping my life bare. I realized that if I fought them now, they would simply hide their tracks better. I had to become the woman they thought I was, a weak, aging fool. That night, I put on a silk robe and waited for David to wake. When he opened his eyes, I didn't yell. I leaned into him, whispering that I was sorry for my outburst. I told him he was right, that family was more important than just fabric. I used every ounce of my charm to disarm him, leading him into a night of intense, blinding intimacy. I made him feel like he had totally won. As he finally fell into a deep, satisfied sleep, the mask of affection dropped from my face. I carefully took his heavy thumb and pressed it against his phone's sensor. The screen glowed, granting me full access to his secrets. I spent the next 3 hours huddled in the bathroom, scrolling through his banking apps and deleted messages. My stomach turned as the paper trail revealed the true depth of their greed. Martha hadn't just been borrowing money, she had been systematically draining our joint wedding account for months. Every fancy dinner, every spa day, and even the gifts she gave to her friends had been paid for with my hard-earned money. I had been unknowingly financing my own humiliation. Then, I found a saved PDF for a retirement gift. It was a contract for a $200,000 luxury condo. The purchase was in my name, but a side agreement stated Martha would live there rent-free forever, with all her expenses covered by my estate. They were planning to bleed me dry until I had nothing left. The morning of the wedding arrived like a gray funeral. I felt numb as I sat in the chair, letting the makeup artist cover the dark circles under my eyes. Martha strutted into the room carrying a plastic bag. She pulled out a cheap, polyester dress she had bought off the rack at a discount store. It felt like sandpaper against my skin. "Wear this and smile for the guests, Rehab," she commanded. "Don't make a scene and embarrass David." I put the scratchy gown on. It hung off my frame, making me look like a pale, hollow ghost of the woman I used to be. As we stood at the back of the church, Martha leaned in, her breath smelling of stale coffee. She whispered, "The villa papers better be signed by the time we hit the reception, or things will get ugly." Walking down the aisle felt like walking toward a cage. I looked at David standing at the altar. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, but all I saw was a vulture waiting for me to die so he could feast. My father's side of the family looked confused, whispering about my cheap, ill-fitting dress. When the minister asked for my vows, I looked David straight in the eye. I said the words "I do" with a clear, steady voice. In my mind, however, I was screaming I am done. I promised to honor him while secretly planning his total destruction. When he leaned in to kiss me, a surge of revulsion hit me so hard I almost gagged. I forced myself to keep my eyes open and smiled for the cameras, playing the part of the perfect, submissive bride. The reception was a sea of fake smiles and expensive champagne. I had made one secret phone call earlier that morning. In the middle of the toast, the collector who had bought my mother's dress walked into the room. I had invited him as my special guest. He was a tall, arrogant man wearing a suit with a very familiar lace pocket square. He walked straight up to our table and shook Martha's hand vigorously. "Thank you again, Martha, for such a fair price on that vintage piece," he said loudly enough for the entire front row to hear. "It's the crown jewel of my collection now." The room went deathly silent. My father's brothers stood up, their faces turning red with anger. The whispers started like a wildfire, and for the first time, Martha looked genuinely panicked. The silence at the reception was broken by David pulling me away. He lied to the guests, saying the mun was confused, then whispered that we were leaving immediately. The next morning, he told me our honeymoon in Italy was cancelled due to a work emergency. I knew the truth. He was taking Martha to inspect the luxury retirement villa using my credit cards. I pretended to be heartbroken, sobbing into my pillow until he left the house. The moment his car pulled out, I sat up and wiped my eyes. I had an appointment with a private investigator I'd hired using a secret cash stash. He met me at a diner and slid a thick manila folder across the table. "Your mother-in-law isn't just a thief, Rehab," he said, leaning in close. "She's a bigamist." My jaw dropped as I stared at the photos. The file was full of evidence I never expected. Martha had a second husband named Gerald in a neighboring state. She had been married to him for 10 years while pretending to be a grieving widow to David. This was where my money was really going. She wasn't just buying Sarah vacations, she was funneling my inheritance to Gerald to pay off his massive underground gambling debts. It turned out the sale of my mother's wedding dress had been a desperate move to stop a bookie from breaking Gerald's legs. Even Sarah's Bali vacation was a total lie. The PI showed me records from a local high-end rehab center. Sarah was drying out from a pill habit on my dime while her mother posted fake vacation photos on Instagram to keep up the family's perfect image. I decided to keep my enemies close. I hosted a family Sunday dinner and cooked Martha's favorite pot roast. I acted like the perfect, doting daughter-in-law, even laughing at David's boring work stories. I let Martha brag about her high society friends while I served her wine. During dessert, I pulled out a glossy, gold-trimmed brochure for the surprise retirement gala I was supposedly planning for her the following month. I told her it would be the social event of the year, with all of David's colleagues and her prestigious circle in attendance. Martha's eyes gleamed with pure greed as she imagined the spotlight. Later that night, I overheard her gloating to David in the hallway. "See? I finally broke her," she hissed. "She's finally useful for something besides her bank account." While they celebrated their perceived victory, my investigator struck gold. He had tracked down the collector and discovered he was just a middleman for a larger firm. My mother's dress hadn't been cut up or altered yet. It was sitting in a climate-controlled security vault 3 towns away, waiting for an international auction. I felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. But there was a catch. The firm wanted a massive finder's fee to pull it from the auction block. I had to use the very last of my liquid cash, money I had saved in a private account since I was 20, to buy back my own mother's soul. It was a staggering amount, but I didn't hesitate for a second. My mother's shield was coming home, no matter the cost. I spent that night alone in a secret hotel room with the dress draped across the bed. I ran my fingers over the familiar lace, feeling the tiny, perfect stitches my mother had made while she was sick. I finally let out the tears I had been holding back since the wardrobe was smashed. I cried for my mother, for my lost trust, and for the foolish woman I had been. But as I touched the fabric, I realized I wasn't just getting a gown back. I was reclaiming my identity. I was no longer Martha's ATM or David's doormat. I was a woman with a weapon. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a nasty text from Martha. "Where are you? David needs his laundry done and the house is a mess." I didn't reply. The retirement gala was only 1 week away, and I was orchestrating every single detail with the precision of a general. I spent my days on the phone with high-end caterers, florists, and a video production team. I told David and Martha that I wanted the evening to be a masterpiece of family legacy. I invited over 200 guests, including David's entire law firm and Martha's social club. Martha was busy picking out a gold sequin gown, acting like she was being crowned queen of the city. I smiled and nodded, showing her the grand reveal video I was supposedly making of her life's work. My heart was a cold stone, but my voice was sweet. Behind the scenes, I was actually coordinating with the private investigator to ensure our special guests arrived exactly on time. I spent the afternoon watching Martha practice her Queen Mother's speech in front of the living room mirror. She talked endlessly about sacrifice, family values, and the hard work it took to raise a successful son like David. She acted as if she had built our lives with her own 2 hands instead of stealing from mine. I stood in the doorway, recording her rehearsal on my phone while she posed and preened. She looked at her reflection with such disgusting pride that it made my skin crawl. David pulled me aside later that evening, looking smug. "You're not still mad about that old lace dress, right, Rehab?" he asked, pointing at his mother's beaming face. "Look how happy she is. This gala is going to make us look like the ultimate power family." The tension reached a breaking point during the gala rehearsal dinner. Martha walked into the dining room wearing a familiar sparkle around her neck. It was my mother's stolen diamond pendant, the one she had promised would always be mine. Martha saw me staring and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She adjusted the jewel so it caught the light, intentionally taunting me in front of the kitchen staff. "It looked better on me anyway, Rehab," she sneered. "Your mother had absolutely no taste in settings. This looks much more expensive on a woman of my status." I felt the familiar roar of anger, but I forced my hands to stay flat on the table. I didn't yell or cry. I just tilted my head and smiled. "You're right, Martha," I said softly. "It looks very expensive." That night, I made the most important call of my life. I contacted Gerald, Martha's other husband. I had found out that he was hiding from debt collectors in a rundown trailer across the state line. I offered him a first-class ticket to the gala and a settlement check that would clear all his gambling debts if he showed up at a specific time and followed my script. "I've been looking for that woman for 10 years, he growled over the phone, his voice sounding like gravel. "She ran off with my last 50,000 and told me she was going to a funeral. I never saw her again." I felt a grim satisfaction as he agreed to the plan. Martha wanted a night she would never forget, and I was going to give it to her. The night before the gala, David tried to be affectionate, sensing that I was becoming distant. I knew I had to keep him blinded for just a few more hours. I played the part of the devoted, loving wife with a desperation that he completely mistook for passion. I laughed at his jokes and told him I couldn't wait for our new beginning after the party. Subscribe for more revenge stories to see how this trap finally snapped shut on David. While he slept deeply, exhausted by his own ego, I moved like a shadow through the house. I packed my final suitcase, my mother's recovered dress, and all my legal documents into the trunk of my car. I left the house keys on the counter and drove to a hotel, leaving the vultures behind forever. The morning of the gala arrived with a cold, sharp wind. The ballroom was a sea of gold and white, decorated with the most expensive lilies money could buy. Martha was already there, draped in her custom-made gold gown that cost more than a small car. She strutted through the room, checking the floral arrangements and barking orders at the catering staff. She looked like royalty, her head held high as she waited for her subjects to arrive. I watched her from the balcony, hidden in the shadows. I had sent a mass BCC email to every single guest on the list with the subject line, "The truth behind the gold." My finger hovered over the send button for a second before I clicked it. The digital bomb was live, but I knew that words on a screen were not enough for a woman like Martha. The email contained every bank statement I had gathered, highlighting each theft in bright red ink. It showed the transfers to Gerald and the payments for Sarah's secret rehab stay. I knew the guests would see it on their phones, but I wanted the live performance to be what finally broke them. As the first guests began to trickle in, I saw several of them checking their devices and then looking up at Martha with horrified expressions. The whispers started almost immediately. Martha, however, was too busy admiring herself in the gilded mirrors to notice the shifting atmosphere. Just then, the collector I had hired arrived at the front door. He wasn't there to enjoy the party as a guest this time. He was a licensed process server, carrying a stack of legal documents that would end Martha's golden era. During the cocktail hour, the room was filled with a thick, uncomfortable tension. Guests huddled in small groups, their eyes darting toward Martha and David. Martha thought they were admiring her beauty, waving her hand at people who quickly turned away. David was at the bar, knocking back scotch and celebrating his big promotion. He had no idea that I had spent the previous week speaking to his board of directors, showing them the evidence of his financial creativity with my accounts. Just as the tension felt like it might snap, Sarah arrived. She had just returned from her vacation in Bali, but she looked terrible. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hair was a mess, and she was clearly under the influence of something. She stumbled toward the buffet, knocking over a tower of champagne flutes. The crash of glass brought the room to a standstill. I stepped out from the shadows and walked slowly down the grand staircase. The lights dimmed automatically, signaling the start of the tribute. I took the microphone and looked out at the 200 faces watching me. Martha was beaming, standing up from her seat of honor to walk toward the stage. She thought this was her moment of glory. "I have a special presentation for the woman who taught me everything I know about value," I said, my voice echoing through the silent hall. Martha stopped at the edge of the stage, her hand over her heart, ready to receive her praise. She had no idea that the tribute video I was about to play was actually a record of her own spectacular downfall. The giant screen behind me didn't show photos of Martha's childhood or her charity work. Instead, the hidden camera footage I had recorded in my dressing room played for the entire room to see. The audio was crystal clear. Every guest heard Martha's voice saying, "I broke her, and it's just fabric." The screen displayed the bank transfers side by side with the photos of my mother's smashed wardrobe. The room went deathly silent, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Martha's face turned the color of old ash as she stared at her own cruel reflection. Then, the heavy front doors swung open. Gerald, the other husband, walked down the center aisle. He looked Martha in the eye and shouted her real name. The gasps from the audience sounded like a collective intake of breath. Gerald marched up to the stage with a heavy, purposeful stride. He didn't look like a grieving widower. He looked like a man who had been robbed of his dignity for a decade. He stood right in front of Martha, who was shaking so violently that her gold sequins rattled. "Hello, Mildred," he shouted, using a name none of us had ever heard. The guests leaned forward, their mouths hanging open in total shock. Gerald turned to the crowd and explained that he had been married to this woman for 10 years and that she had disappeared with his life savings. Martha tried to scream that he was a liar, but Gerald didn't hesitate. He pulled a thick stack of papers from his jacket and handed them to her. They were legal summons for bigamy, grand larceny, and fraud. Martha's legs finally gave out, and she collapsed. Martha scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed at the top of her lungs. "It doesn't matter what you say, rehab. I have the signed deed to the luxury condo. You signed it in front of the lawyer. I have a home forever and there is nothing you can do." I stepped closer to the edge of the stage and gripped the microphone tighter. "I signed a lease, Martha, not a deed," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterics. "It is for a 200-square-foot studio apartment in the most dangerous part of town. And the first month's rent? I paid for it by selling every piece of jewelry I found in your nightstand." I reached out and ripped my mother's diamond pendant right off her neck in front of everyone. David finally snapped out of his shock and tried to rush the stage to defend his mother. He was red-faced and screaming about how I was a crazy woman who was ruining his life. I didn't flinch. I simply signaled the tech booth to play the final audio recording. The speakers boomed with David's own voice from the office weeks ago, calmly agreeing to liquidate Rehab's assets to pay for his mother's villa. The betrayal was so clear and cold that even his closest friends backed away from him. Suddenly, David's boss, the senior partner at the law firm, stood up from his table. He looked at David with pure disgust. "David, don't even bother coming in on Monday morning," he barked. "We don't employ thieves or people who prey on their own wives. You are finished in this city." The chaos continued as Sarah, seeing her mother's power vanish, had a complete meltdown in the middle of the ballroom. She started screaming at Martha, blaming her for ruining everything and not stealing enough money to keep them safe. In her drug-fueled rage, she accidentally revealed the truth that had been hidden for years. She shouted that Martha hated me because I reminded her of the honest life she could never have. She wanted your money because she was jealous of your soul, Rehab. Sarah shrieked. Then, in a desperate attempt to save herself, she pointed toward the floor. She revealed that the rest of the stolen cash was hidden inside the lining of Martha's old fur coats in the basement. I watched as the police officers, who had been waiting in the back, stepped forward to take notes. I didn't just want a scene, I wanted justice. I had called the fraud department hours ago, and they had been watching the entire presentation from the lobby. 4 uniformed officers entered the ballroom, their handcuffs jingling with a metallic finality. They walked straight to Martha, who was now weeping on the floor, her gold dress stained with spilled wine. As they pulled her arms behind her back, the crowd watched in absolute silence. Martha looked at me one last time, her face a mask of pure hatred and defeat. As she was escorted past me toward the exit, I leaned down and whispered into her ear so only she could hear. "It's just fabric, right, Martha? I hope you enjoy the fabric of your orange jumpsuit." She let out a final, pathetic wail as the doors closed behind her. With Martha gone, I turned my attention to David. He was standing in the middle of the empty dance floor, looking like a man who had watched his entire world vanish in an instant. I didn't feel any pity for him as I reached into my clutch and pulled out a set of legal papers. I didn't hand him a divorce petition, I handed him an annulment based on fraud. "You were never my husband, David," I said, my voice cold and steady. "You were just a squatter in my life who was waiting for me to provide a paycheck." He tried to beg, claiming he was brainwashed by his mother, but I cut him off. I revealed that I had already emptied our joint account, which was legally my money anyway, and moved every cent back into my private trust. He had $0 to his name. I returned to our house that night, but I wasn't alone. I had Martha's other husband, Gerald, and 2 police officers with me to ensure things went smoothly. Since the house had been in my name long before the marriage, I had the legal right to remove David immediately. I watched from the porch as the officers handed him a small trash bag for his things. He looked pathetic, shivering in the cold night air. When he was finally on the curb, I realized I still had that cheap, polyester mall dress Martha had forced me to wear at the wedding. I balled it up and threw it right at his face. "Take this with you," I shouted. "It's the only thing in this house you actually paid for." I locked the door and finally felt the air return to my lungs. The next morning, I drove to the secure vault 3 towns over. I felt a strange nervousness as the clerk turned the heavy keys and pulled out the long, white box. When I lifted the lid, the scent of lavender filled the air, and there it was, my mother's dress. The lace was untouched, glowing under the fluorescent lights like a miracle. I took it to a private dressing room and put it on. It fit me perfectly now, far better than it had on my wedding day. I realized that the bloat Martha had mocked was just the heavy weight of the lies and the stress I had been carrying. Standing there in my mother's stitches, I knew I was finally free. I wasn't just recovering a garment, I was recovering the woman my mother knew I could be. As I was taking the dress off to pack it away safely, my finger caught on something near the hem. I looked closer and found a tiny, hidden pocket sewn into the inner lining that I had never noticed before. My heart skipped a beat as I reached inside and pulled out a small, yellowed letter. It was my mother's handwriting, dated 10 years ago. "If you are wearing this, Rehab, it means you finally found the strength I hoped for," the letter began. I sat on the floor, tears streaming down my face as I read her words of encouragement from beyond the grave. At the very bottom, there was a postscript that changed everything. P.S. If things get hard, look under the loose floorboard in my old sewing room. I left a shield for your future. I drove straight to my mother's old house, which I had kept as a rental property. I went into the small sewing room and pushed aside the heavy desk. I found the loose floorboard and pried it up with a hammer. Underneath sat a small, fireproof metal box. My heart hammered as I lifted the lid. Inside, I didn't find old photos or junk. I found a massive stash of gold coins and the original deeds to several commercial properties in the city center that Martha never knew existed. My mother had been much wealthier than she ever let on, and she had hidden it all to ensure it stayed out of the hands of anyone like the vultures I had just escaped. I stared at the fortune, realizing that I was now more powerful than Martha had ever dreamed of being in her wildest fantasies. This was the true inheritance, the one built on love and foresight, not theft. I stood up, feeling like a giant. My mother had protected me one last time, even from the grave. I decided to use a small portion of that new fortune to put a final period on Martha's story. While she sat in her jail cell awaiting trial, she tried to sue me for elder abuse and emotional distress. David joined her, begging for a second chance while sleeping on his sister's couch. I ignored every call and every letter. Instead, I hired the most aggressive legal team in the state to crush every motion they filed. I made sure the court knew about the bigamy and the gambling debts. While they fought for crumbs, I bought the retirement home Martha actually deserved, a crumbling, state-run facility with no amenities and gray walls. I made sure that if she ever got out of prison, that would be her only legal residence. I was done being a victim. I was now the architect of their misery. Payback closure felt like a slow, cooling rain. With no money left and no mother to enable her lifestyle, Sarah was forced to face the real world for the first time. She lost her luxury apartment and her expensive car within a month. One afternoon, I went to the local dry cleaners to pick up my mother's preserved wedding dress. As I stepped up to the counter, I locked eyes with the woman working behind it. It was Sarah. She looked haggard, her designer nails broken and her skin sallow from the stress of a minimum-wage job. She stared at me, her mouth open in a silent plea for help. I didn't say a single word. I simply took my pristine white box, reached into my purse, and left a single $1 bill on the counter as a tip. I walked out without looking back once. A year later, I decided it was time for one final meeting. I visited Martha in prison. She looked 100 years old, her hair gray and thin, her skin sagging like wet paper. She sat behind the glass, looking broken and defeated. "Why did you have to destroy us, Rehab?" she asked, her voice a pathetic whimper. I leaned in close to the glass, my expression cold and immovable. "Because you thought my mother's memory was a paycheck, Martha," I said clearly. "You thought her love was something you could sell for a vacation. It wasn't a paycheck. It was a promise that I would never let someone like you win." I held up a photo of my new life, of me standing on the deck of a beautiful beach house, smiling and holding a glass of wine. I spent the evening at that beach house, watching the sun dip below the horizon. I wasn't alone anymore. I was surrounded by friends who actually respected me for who I am. I built a small bonfire on the sand, the orange flames dancing against the dark sky. I pulled the cheap, polyester mall dress out of a bag, the one David had tried to replace my mother's soul with. I threw it into the heart of the fire. I watched as the fake fabric curled and blackened, turning into nothing but ash and smoke. That same afternoon, I had received a letter from David. He was homeless and sleeping in his car, begging for just a few dollars for a meal. I didn't even open it. I dropped the envelope into the flames and watched it burn to nothing. The next morning, I stood in my garden as the sun rose over the water. The air was fresh and smelled of salt and possibilities. I realized that my life didn't start when I met David, and it didn't end when Martha stole my dress. Those people were just shadows that tried to dim my light. They tried to strip me of my past to fund their greedy future. But they forgot one very important thing. A dress can be sold, but the woman who wears it is priceless. I smoothed my hair and took a deep breath of the morning air. I didn't just cancel a retirement gala. I finally started my own life on my own terms. I walked back into my beautiful home, the master of my own destiny. The shield was no longer a dress, it was me. Thank you. Please like, share and subscribe for more. Also turn on your notification bell so you be the first to get our next shocking revenge story.